from the Alive National Centre. Today we're going to be looking at our research funding event, or Research Funding Galaxy, where we have a panel of wonderful people who will talk to us about some of their tips about how to go about getting research. So I would like to acknowledge, well, for me, I'm sitting on the beautiful Turrbal and Yagara lands. So I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands, which we're all meeting today, and pay respects to our elders past, present, and extend that respect to Indigenous people present today. I also would like to recognise the lived experience within the room today, and that we speak honourably and respectfully about ongoing emotional distress, experience of trauma and mental ill health, and the work of caring and the experience of care within this context. So a little bit about us, the Next Gen Research Network. We're all quite new to this, so we're still figuring out what our role is, but as co-leads of the Next Gen Research Network, we're hoping to sort of bring a group of people together to look at mental health and to develop the next generation of mental health research leaders. And we're really passionate about delivering capacity and building support and building connections and networks to help us all sort of move mental health research forward. And this is who we are. Our leads are Emma and Lena, and then there's Terry, myself, Kaylee, Gioletta, Anna and Tegan, who are all the co-leads. So hopefully you'll get to know us as we sort of move through the rest of the year. And so this is the Alive model and where we sit. You can see, I'm sure everyone's very familiar with Alive and what that their brief is trying to achieve, but they have the 4 research strands. And I think the Lived Experience Research Network and the Next Gen Network sort of sit in the middle and hopefully can help sort of feed into each of those research streams and sort of build those connections to help bring people together. So we have the Lived Experience Carer Family Kinship leads who are on the screen there. So hopefully you'll also get to know those leads as well, co-leads. And then there's Dana, Glenn and Caroline, who are the hub, who get us all organised and support us and help us move things forward. So I actually need to say thank you to Dana, Glenn and Caroline for all the work that they do to help us, and particularly in getting this event organised today. So what's the plan today? Firstly, we're going to have a welcome from Professor Jane Pirkis, and then going to introduce the panelists, and then have a Q&A session. So I guess the idea about today is for people to ask questions, to pick the brains of the brightest and see if they can help us sort of come up with ideas and ways to improve our access to funding for our research. So I'll just hand over to Jane now for the introduction. Thanks, Jane.
Sorry, you would think I'd worked out how to unmute myself after all this time. Thank you, and welcome everybody. So I got asked to provide a welcome, and I'd really sincerely like to welcome everybody here. I don't know that you're going to hear from the brightest. I think the brightest in the room are probably the people who are coming up through the ranks. So some of us will tell you a little bit about our experiences, but your experiences may end up being a bit different. Hopefully we can provide a few tips for consideration about how we've got to where we have. I'm just going to share my screen. So, sorry. So I'm very obedient. So I faithfully used on my title slide the name of the session, A Researcher's Guide to the Mental Health Funding Galaxy, and then my presentation, which was a welcome and overview of funding in the mental health research landscape. So I looked at that and I thought, we've got a galaxy and we've got a landscape. I wondered whether that might create some confusion, but fortunately, I found this picture of a landscape with a galaxy. So I thought I'd just talk a little bit about different ways of thinking about what research opportunities there might be, and some sort of initial tips from me, but I think we're going to talk about some more tips when we come together as a panel. So I wondered about whether I should just list different funding opportunities in the mental health research area. But I decided that that probably wasn't the best way to do things for a number of reasons. One of which is there's no way it could be exhaustive. And another of which is I think it would be counterproductive to think about purely mental health research opportunities. I think it's much better to think about overall research funding opportunities and potentially a few additional ones that might be mental health specific. And I also think that it's better to think about ways of classifying them rather than to try to provide a list of examples. So I thought about the different ways that I think about research funding opportunities. So one of them is the herd C categories that you might know about or might have heard people talk about. So people talk about four categories of research funding. Category 1 funding is funding from Australian competitive grants. So that's your NH and MRC funding, your ARC funding. There are some mental health specific funding schemes that sometimes get listed on the what was the Australian Competitive Grants Register. So for example, I think Suicide Prevention Australia's funding schemes are listed as Category 1 grants. There are also, so then we move on to Category 2 grants, which are other public sector funding opportunities, and in particular, contract research for government departments, so tenders for particular pieces of work for government departments. And I have to say that I've been quite fortunate with tenders, and I'd really recommend thinking about that as a funding avenue because they're competitive, but sometimes judged in a slightly different way to the standard NH and MRC or ARC grants. And also they're often pieces of work that can have a real impact. So maybe it's a different way of thinking about what funding opportunities might be there and what they might lead to. Category 3 grants are funded through industry, so-called industry. So they might include things like philanthropic funds, and I think we'll talk a little bit about that later. And then Category 4 funding is cooperative research centre funding, which is a much smaller pool really of funding and quite more specific. So the herd C categories is one way of thinking about things. That's often how universities think about funding. They classify all their grant income into those herd C categories. But I think there are two other ways that are maybe worth thinking about research funding as well for us as a group. One is distinguishing between program and project-based funding versus person-based. So that's funding for particular projects or programs versus fellowship funding or as we have now from the NH and MRC investigator grant funding. And the reason I mention that is that there are different ways to craft those sorts of funding applications. So obviously the person-based ones are all about you, but the project-based ones are often about the best team to do the work and also the best project. So, so thinking about the team that you might work with is really important in distinguishing between the two. But the other thing I would say is that you can often leverage from one to the other, and I'll make that point again in a minute. And then the third way of classifying research funding is general research funding versus mental health specific research funding. So as I said, I did think about the idea of listing a suite of mental health specific funding opportunities that I've known of over the years, but I'm just not sure that's really helpful because it's such a small drop in the ocean compared to all the other funding opportunities. So, you would definitely want to be considering the bigger general funding schemes like NH and MRC and like tenders, the works. But there are some mental health specific funding schemes that are worth mentioning. So Australian Rotary Health has funding that's specifically for mental health research. They had their funding on hold during COVID, but they're funding a round of projects now. They also fund person-based grants, so they fund scholarships and fellowships, or postdoctoral fellowships. Suicide Prevention Australia is another example. They have research funding that they use to fund both projects and person-based funding. And then internationally, there are other examples as well. So the National Institute of Mental Health, for example, has funding rounds. The American Foundation for Suicide Prevention has funding rounds. So there are definitely some schemes to think about and to keep your eyes open for, but really they're, as I say, a bit of a drop in the ocean. You're better off to hitch your wagon, or whatever the expression is, to the bigger funding schemes, I think. So my tips. So I'm continuing in the theme of galaxies. I thought I would provide you with these 6 tips that have the acronym COSMOS. So the first one is collaboration. So coming up through the ranks as early and mid-career people, particularly if you're applying for project or program grant funding, there may well be advantages in not being the first named investigator, but you want a really good collaborative team around you. Or you might be the first named investigator, but you still want a good collaborative team around you. So it's worth thinking about who you collaborate with, joining forces with people from other institutions, other disciplinary backgrounds, making sure there's a good mix of people with lived experience, people with pure research backgrounds. So collaborating cleverly, I guess. Second, my O in Cosmos, my first O in Cosmos is openness to opportunities. So in fact, I might talk about the O and the S together. So I think it's wise to be opportunistic and strategic at the same time. So you want to be absolutely opportunistic and hop onto any scheme that comes around that you think you have the opportunity to seek some funding through. There's also often good potential for opportunistically recycling grants. So if you've had a grant that maybe wasn't successful in one scheme, perhaps there's opportunities in another scheme. But at the same time, you need to be strategic. So you need to have an eye to what grant opportunities are coming up. And most importantly, I think you need to make sure that you're well positioned for applying for different schemes. So I know, for example, at our university, there's often an emphasis on helping people craft an investigator grant, which is really important. But equally as important is thinking 2 years out from that, what you need to do to make your track record look really good, to make sure that you're really well positioned for that investigator grant. And the same applies to all those other kinds of funding opportunities as well. I would say keep your eyes open for multiple and diverse funding sources. And I mentioned tenders before. I have built a career on work that I've got funded through government tenders, and it's been fantastic. It's been really given me the opportunity to work with policymakers and people on the ground that I wouldn't have had probably if I'd only stuck to those Category 1 grants. So for me, Category 2 funding has been really important. One thing leading to another. So this is the leveraging thing. I think it's really important to think about how you might leverage from one thing to another. So it might be from a project to some person-based funding. It might be that boosts your track record, but also it might be that it's worth applying for grants that are quite small, even though it might seem like a lot of effort, because that may well lead to something else. So it's worth thinking about where things sit in the scheme of things. And then the final thing is support. So it's really important, particularly if you're at an earlier career stage than an old bat like me, to be thinking about where, to be trying to make sure you get the best supports possible. So make sure you have people around you who will read your grant applications and give you that support about thinking about how you best position yourself. And you know, there's lots of great supervisors around, and hopefully you've got really good supervisors, but if you haven't, seek other mentors, look for really good support. So they're my initial top tips. I'll have some more later. And so I just wanted to end on the same slide that I started on. And the reason I put this up is because I really wanted to make that point again about there is this galaxy of funding, but only a very small number of these little bright spots in the galaxy are mental health specific funding. And so it's definitely worth keeping an eye out for those bright stars. But I think if you're wise, you'll be keeping an eye on the much bigger galaxy. So thanks, that's it from me.
Thanks so much, Jane, for such a very generous sharing of your wisdom and experience. And it was particularly interesting to hear about the sourcing of funding from tenders, which is probably something that I hadn't thought of very much or have much knowledge about, and perhaps others in the audience might also have not come across that as much and might have some questions to ask about that. So that was much appreciated. And I think you also distilled the complexity of the universe into an understandable landscape, which I greatly appreciated. And I did, it did resonate, that final slide about how there were the small stars were the mental health funds, and it gets me onto my bandwagon a little bit as well, because I work in the mental health of older adults, and I feel like the people I work with are discriminated against on two levels: discrimination because mental health isn't given enough attention, and discrimination because of ageism. So I won't go on about that, but that's something that I get upset about. So on that note, I should continue on to introduce our wonderful panelists, who are all distinguished researchers, and I'll call them a panel of stars in our universe. And I just realized I didn't introduce myself before. So I'm Terry Chong, so apologies. I'm one of the co-leads in the Next Generation Network as well. So I'll do a very brief bio for each and introduce each in turn, because I know on Zoom it's difficult if it's not sequential. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce firstly Lena Sanci, and I'll ask each panelist to briefly introduce themselves and also let us know about their recent grant successes. That's our kind of first intro. And Lena is the Head of Department, Director of Teaching and Learning, and co-lead of the Children and Young People's Research Stream, and she's at the Department of General Practice at the University of Melbourne. Thanks, Lena.
Yes, thanks for that, Terence. So what do you want me to do? Just say what my research grant?
A brief introduction and okay. Some recent grant successes.
Yes, well, I just put in the notes and about Jane's clarity there, and the way she uses the titles and things and integrates them in her responses, one key criteria for success. So I just wanted to call that out. It was a fantastic presentation, Jane. Yeah, I really go on to the collaboration thing, and my recent grant successes have been clever collaborations and taking strategic opportunities. So we had an MRFF Million Minds grant with led by Professor Sandra Eads that I was CIB on, but it was really bringing our two worlds of research together to work with Indigenous young people and their mental health. That was one. Another second clever collaboration was with Professor in Paediatrics Raghu Lingam and Harriet Hiscock, where we strategically put something into the primary care stream about strengthening care for rural children in the Clinician-led researcher grant, and I was the CIA on that, and that was actually a collaborative effort and a recycled grant from another scheme, but was only 4% of that stream got funded, so we were fortunate enough to get that funding. They're probably the two main recent ones that I've had, but I've been on a lot of collaborative ones. The Young Stroke Service was another one where we were contributing expertise and writing of that. And one with Jane Hocking as well, that was last year, which was a trial that again brought our two worlds together but I didn't lead the writing of that one, but put a lot of content in. So that's my recent success.
Fantastic. Thanks, Lena. It sounds like you've had a lot of recent successes, which is great. And also nicely highlighting, if I was remembering right, the C in Cosmos earlier. So that's great. I'm also really pleased to introduce our next panelist as well, who is Diane Shanley, who is the co-lead of the Changing Health Systems, or CHESS research group within the Menzies Health Institute of Queensland at Griffith University in the Gold Coast. So thanks so much, Diane. I'll hand over to you to intro yourself and talk about recent successes.
Sure. Yeah, I'm an associate professor at Griffith. Hi, everyone. And Jane, I want to echo what Lena said in that I loved your presentation, and it very much spoke to my career, particularly in the last 5 years. I too have very much capitalized on Category 2 funding, and then built from that into Category 1 funding and Category 3 funding. So diversity in funding is definitely key. In the last 5 years, I've been a chief investigator on probably over 20 million in research funding, and I am the CIA on three sequential grants, 2 of which are funded by the Department of Health Commonwealth, and 1 of which is an NHMRC partnership, and those total 6.2 million. So that keeps me pretty busy. And then I also like the Category 3 funding because of our partners. We do have a lot of collaborations with industry, and a lot of those sort of consultancy funds come in to give us some consistency as well across different projects. Fantastic. So I don't know if you want me to go into more detail on that, on what the projects are about, but that's kind of an overview of my funding.
Yeah, then that's brilliant, Diane. That's a great introduction, and I'm sure we may have more questions to ask later on. But again, it shows why we have so many stars on the panel with all the recent successes. It's really wonderful to hear. So thank you, Diane, and I'll introduce next. Our next star on the panel is Michelle Banfield, who is the head of Lived Experience Research at the ANU Centre for Mental Health Research and the Lived Experience Lead for the Alive National Centre for Mental Health Research Translation. So thanks for joining our panel today, Michelle.
Thanks, Terry. Yeah, I went on a bit of an adventure this morning to look through some metrics, you know, when I saw what it is that we're supposed to be talking about. And so I did a bit of a deep dive into what ANU keeps on me. And I actually don't believe what they've got written about me, because they said that I applied for 28 grants last year. Really? Maybe that's why I don't have time to do anything else. Yeah, look, picking up, I also loved what Jane presented about the variety of things that you can actually apply for, and looking at, you know, my success over the last 5 years. I've been on 25 grants and contracts since 2018, 10 of which I've led, but only 6 of those are traditional Category 1 grants. So NHMRC, MRFF, Suicide Prevention Australia. 11 of them are government contracts, including some work with Jane. Thank you, Jane, for including me in those kinds of things. But the remainder are also consultancies for the sector and university funding and that kind of thing. And I really want to echo what Jane said about having a diversity in there and building your career from a whole heap of different perspectives, because it's a really powerful way of actually getting some runs on the board, particularly when you're early career, and being able to then build up into your Category 1 grant. So I've had an ARC DECRA. I've also had an MRFF Translating Research into Practice Fellowship. Based on what I've heard about the current investigator grants, that is completely off the table for me now. But I do have my sights set on an ARC Future Fellowship as a possibility. I am one of those people who has never had an ongoing position, and I still don't have an ongoing position. I've always been on fixed term contracts, and so I'm always looking for where my salary is going to come from in the next year or two. So doing a variety of different things and finding from a whole heap of different perspectives is what's let me build up in very small increments, though, because my tally sits at about 10 million in total funding, but that represents 40 different projects over my career. And so building it up, you know, tens of thousands at a time, rather than in the last, you know, like last year, that part of those successes, 18 of the 28 were actually successful, and that represents about $5 million in funding that's come in the last year. So you can see how things actually develop over the years. The other thing I want to say about this is, and this is a shout out to our lived experience researchers who are on the line today, everything that I do is about lived experience. And so throughout my career, first of all, it was being, you know, the early career researcher, bringing lived experience into things and getting the opportunities to work with more senior researchers on those sort of things. Now it's about lived experience leadership, and it's about bringing a lived experience perspective into spaces where it hasn't been before.
That's fantastic. Thanks so much, Michelle. And such a really important point about having lived experience at the centre of research and also at the leadership of research. So I really thank you for including that, and also was so blown away by the number of grants that you do. It kind of scares me to think how many forms and reports and things have to be done for that number. But so very much admire the number, but also the successes and your very important point about the centrality of lived experience in our work. So they're all the stars that we have in our present universe, but we also have an intergalactic panelist. That was Dana's words. Blame Dana. But I'm happy to take credit for the term. And this is Luke Burchill, who's an adult congenital cardiologist and clinical researcher at the University of Melbourne, Royal Melbourne Hospital and the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, USA, proud member of the Yorta Yorta and Jaja Wurrung Nations. And he unfortunately can't be with us today because he's in Rochester, USA, but he's beamed us a nice video so he can be here in the stratosphere somewhere, I guess. Thanks very much, Luke.
So Dana,
can anyone hear? I can't hear.
No, you need to start again and share it through sound.
Man from Victoria's Aboriginal communities.
You can't hear it? You can.
It leads the Indigenous Health Equity Group at the University of Melbourne. Hi, my name is Luke Burchill. I am an Associate Professor of Medicine at the University of Melbourne, a proud Yorta Yorta and Jaja Wurrung man from Victoria's Aboriginal communities. I lead the Indigenous Cardiovascular Health Equity Group at the University of Melbourne, and I am also Indigenous co-lead of the Australian Stroke Alliance, where we have created DARAC to centre Indigenous governance across the Australian Stroke Alliance and as a future model for Indigenous health research in Australia. I am an adult congenital heart disease specialist and therefore a clinician researcher, and was recently recruited to Mayo Clinic, Rochester, USA to lead the development of an adult congenital heart failure care pathway. So in terms of contexts, I work across many different contexts, both Indigenous and mainstream, Australia and the United States, cardiovascular research, and also adult congenital heart disease research, health outcomes and health equity research. As an Indigenous researcher, one of the major challenges that I have experienced has been the cultural load of Indigenous leadership, but also the academic isolation associated with being an Indigenous leader. On the other hand, I have gained a great deal by working across the different contexts that I do. And I do think it's important that we have Indigenous research and Indigenous researchers working in the mainstream and finding solutions for Indigenous people, for Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people who are operating in mainstream settings, including in healthcare, education, and in research. My top tips for early and mid-career researchers, especially clinician scientists, are: 1, clarify your why. Why are you motivated to do this research? And does it align with your passion? It needs to. Clinical practice supporting research and vice versa. It's really important that they are interconnected. 3, consider the 4 Ps in everything you do: place, people, purpose, and process. And 4, recognise that a career in research is a decision that impacts not only you, but your family. It's hard to be successful in research without the support of your family. So regular check-ins with your partner and family support is vital. Thank you.
Great. Okay, well, thank you, Luke, for that video. I'll introduce myself. So my name is Kaylee Tapp, and I'm one of the Next Gen co-leads as well, and I'm the one who's going to be guiding you through our Q&A portion, which is what we've got up to now. So when we were kind of coming up with the idea for this, we really liked the idea of, you know, having as low key as possible as you can via Zoom, but, you know, really a chat and an opportunity for our next gen, you know, early and mid-career researchers to ask questions of people who really have been successful at getting grants, because we felt for sure that it's sometimes very daunting. You know, there's funding out there and you definitely know that you're supposed to be getting it, but not necessarily, you know, how to do it. So we're really grateful to have all of you here today to help us share those top tips. I'll also encourage people who are in the audience, to, as Vicky's just said in the chat, to post any questions. And we're going to also jump in with those, as well as some of the others that we've got through the crowdsourcing platform that we're going to start off with. So our first question, so leveraging off the video we got from Luke, so it might be a bit more of a question for Michelle, but anyone else is also welcome to chime in. You know, Luke spoke about the cultural load of Indigenous leadership and how that could feel, you know, a little bit isolating potentially. So, you know, one of our first questions was about whether this might be something shared from a lived experience perspective as well.
Yeah, thanks, Kaylee. Yeah, that resonated with me when I heard Luke say that you know, people, I mean, I think that research in and of itself can be an isolating kind of activity, particularly when you're thinking about the schemes that focus very much on individuals, like fellowship schemes. However, it doesn't have to be that way. And that's, I think, one of the most important ones out of Jane's Cosmos was that collaboration and, you know, surrounding yourself with good people, because one of the things that's happening now, which is one of those double-edged swords in the lived experience space, is the considerations of everybody suddenly realizing that lived experience should be in their grant. And that's great, except that there's a whole lot of people who don't know what that actually means. And so, you know, one of the reasons that those statistics for me last year were so frightening, I had no idea there were 28 last year, that was a whole lot of people who suddenly stood up and went, we need lived experience in our grants. Come and be our lived experience person. And what I would say to early and mid-career researchers in that is sometimes, particularly when you're very early in your career, the temptation can be to grab at everything. Oh my God, I need to build everything. But particularly if you're coming from a lived experience space, and I imagine the same holds in an Indigenous space, be careful. Because if it isn't actually aligned with your principles, or if you think that perhaps what they're doing is ticking a box, it probably will do more harm than good to the career. So, you know, I encourage people to look for opportunities to align themselves with people who are going for funding and who are, you know, seeking this kind of thing. But do be a little bit picky about who it is that you actually align yourself with, and particularly if you're doing it from a lived experience perspective. In the long run, if what we're wanting to do is do quality lived experience research and encourage our lived experience researchers and our early career researchers to be involved in good things, we actually have to encourage the people who are doing the applying to do it properly and do it well.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I think that's a really important point. You know, the need to be considerate rather than just trying to tick a box. I think otherwise it's not really achieving the goal, is it? All right, so our next question then. So in his presentation, Luke mentioned the 4 Ps, so place, people, process, and practice. And, you know, these apply in all kinds of funding. Lena, we were wondering if you could talk a little bit around how these might actually apply more specifically to grants around young people.
Yeah, I guess when researching with young people, I think that the idea of centering the lived experience there is really important. And I think in youth health, we've known about co-design and co-production for decades and decades before it was sort of recognised more broadly, because adolescents are self-determining and they've got particular views of the world that most of the rest of us don't understand the adolescent brain, and we want to be able to understand and empathise with it and create platforms for empowerment, because they are often disadvantaged and marginalised in society because they are too young to vote, and they're not young enough to be advocated for by parents in the same way. So I think that it's that centering youth voice and views on how research is conducted, the methodologies, the sorts of questions that you want to highlight and answer. And then as a researcher also, it's important to think about process with young people, because in that age range from 10 to 25, there is a process of maturing and becoming, having a legal adult status. So to what extent can the young people consent on their own behalf to participate in research? And is it okay to require parental consent, or maybe for the things that you're researching and the area you're researching in, it isn't okay? So for example, in my grants, they're all about young people's views of health services. And I like to talk to young people who are turning up to health services about their experiences and what they're coming for. Those young people might be coming to a place not wanting anybody else to know. So at what age can we actually effectively recruit them to consent on their own behalf? And what sort of research are we doing that is minimal risk in the situation where we're asking them to be mature minors and consent on their own behalf? So and what duties do we have as researchers to ensure that we're not placing them in future risk or current vulnerability? So all those things make the process and the practice of research really important. And then the place is also influenced. Again, you are often trying to, I mentioned a health setting, but other places where young people are. So in schools, and that has a whole other layer of ethical hurdles to go through, and governance hurdles that you often can't get around. So sometimes it is impossible to engage young people in research without parental consent if you're going via a school, although there have been some precedents around that, that where you can argue for a waiver of parental consent, but that may not be desirable or helpful. So you have to sort of weigh up those situations and context, and then general population would be the other, or, through social media is the other avenue. And that way young people are coming forward on their own, which does actually put the onus even more on researchers to ensure that they can ascertain maturity for engagement and to ensure safety in the process and distress protocols and all those sorts of things. So I wonder if that kind of addresses some of those points.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. I think for me, it also highlights the importance, as Jane was talking about, of that collaboration and then also mentorship and things as well, because they're just when, you were talking, it makes you think that, well, there is so much that people who've done this or are used to doing this, have learned through the process that we need to take into account. And so, the importance of people to mentor you along the way, rather than, have to learn all of that when you're trying to do the grant application, which in itself can be a lot when you're, especially in ECR, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And we were part of a CRE on exactly that, the Wellbeing, Health and Young People CRE, which has tips for researchers that are working with young people for precisely that reason, to hand on some of those tips. Yeah.
Great, well, thank you. So our next one, we're going to open it up to the whole of the panel, and this one's sort of quite a broad one, but we were kind of interested, in your top tips for getting, funding. So if you had to, just think of maybe your top 3, if you've got 3, what you would suggest that you do at that ECR or mid-career researcher level.
I can have a shot if you like. So as someone who has sat on a lot of assessment panels, I would say 3 things. So these are kind, they might sound quite basic because they're not about, choosing which grants to go for or whatever. This is once you're writing the grant, I would say make it as easy as possible for the assessors. So no matter how important you think all the information is, make sure you remove enough so there's some white space in the application, so that it's not just this dense wall of text for assessors to read. Don't use acronyms, because there's nothing that puts assessors off more. That I can't remember from one page to the next what the acronym stands for. And I guess the other thing I'd say is absolutely really think carefully about the selection criteria and make sure you write your application to those criteria. But if there are things that you feel like aren't reflected in the criteria that you think are really important to tell the assessor, weave them in. So for example, in the current investigator grants, the track record is really important, but there's no place for describing the amount of funding you've brought in. So if that's important and you want that to be reflected in the story, weave that in somehow. Similarly, in the recent round of investigator grants, the way you demonstrate your track record largely is through your publications, and you just list your top 10. And that's perhaps disadvantageous for some disciplines who maybe publish more but find it, aren't publishing in Nature or the Lancet every second week. So again, maybe sometimes weave in that information on the quantity of your publications somehow somewhere else in the application. But the main point I'm trying to make really is absolutely think about the selection criteria and write your grant application to those criteria.
Yeah, and just following up on that, is also having done investigator grant review for quite a few years, I think that the one thing that really shows is passion. And that was something that Luke actually mentioned. If you're passionate about what you're doing and you understand and demonstrate that you love what you do, it shows and it excites reviewers. And I always remember the very first year that I did investigator grants, when I don't know what they did with their assignment, but I ended up with stuff that was so far out of my area, I had no idea what was going on. But my absolute favourite from that round was a basic science one that had something to do with mouse models. And like I can't actually tell you what he was doing, but his application was so beautifully written, so well constructed, and he was obviously so invested in what he did. My response as a reviewer was, go forth and do whatever it is that you're doing.
I think those are really good points. Diane, did you have something you wanted to say?
I think when you first start out, and still now, by the way, this is just continuous, I think, throughout one's career, is that you tend to almost bite off more than you can chew. And this kind of builds on what Jane was saying. You bite off more than you can chew in one grant. It's like, I don't know if it's just the way we think, we add a little bit more and a little bit more. And the sequence of your grant ends up becoming this big behemoth. And really just take that right back to the first question. And then love the behemoth that you developed, right? Love that, hold on to it. Because that's going to become your sequencing. That's going to become your next grant. So ask yourself at all times, what's the empirical question I'm trying to ask with this grant? And if you've got 3 in there, watch out. And that's how you cut it back to just 1. And that gives you a bit more white space. It gives you a bit more clear narrative. You're not confusing your assessors with, multiple goals and, well, how does this, and inevitably when you get aim 1, aim 2, and aim 3, and it sounds like aim 2 is contingent upon aim 1, what the assessor is going to say is, well, what happens if aim 1 doesn't work out? So what you don't want are sections of your grant that are contingent upon each other. Hold that part for your next grant. And that's very much what I did in my career. That was absolutely an asset. And that was advice that somebody else had given to me, was just break it up. And that formed the sequence of grants that ended up getting funding. And that looks really lovely to an assessor, to see that you're building upon your past projects, developing a coherent narrative. That would be my unique advice that's outside of what we've already said.
Yeah, and I would just like to add to that. I think that's great advice, and what Jane and Michelle said too. And my tips were divided between the vision and the passion and the craft, the grantsmanship, and it's a huge part of it. So I think, to add to what everyone else has said about the vision and the passion, this has to be an idea that you want to do anyway, that if this doesn't get funded, you really want to do this, and you'll find any other way to do it, another scheme. And that comes through, because in my life, I've also been made to write things because we need money coming in, and you think, oh, this isn't really going to fly. And yeah, okay, I'll take a hit for the team, I'll write it. And they inevitably never get up. Sometimes they do, if you write well, like you're relying on your grantsmanship to sell anything, because you're a bit like a used car salesman in this, and you have to know how to sell the idea. That's the grantsmanship. But the ones that are really come through in the end, I think, are other runs where you've got the true passion and you've researched the idea. And as Jane said earlier, you've brought people together to flesh out exactly how best to represent this, and you're across your literature, so you know where the cutting edge is and where you want to pitch it. But the grantsmanship is so important, and I think for early career researchers, that's where you do need the mentorship, and you need enough time. You really need to quarantine time. And I know, Jane, if I can, you spend at least 2 months writing a big grant, like that might be your full-time job doing that. And it's iterative and reiterative until you've sold that message with clarity and conciseness, consistency of language, really key messages in the way you set it out. So looking at some other successful ones, or asking people to assist you with shape, how to position things, is really important, and the creativity in doing that. But the clarity is important, and linking your idea to global and national initiatives. If you can somehow get that impetus that actually the whole world is waiting for this research, I think that'd be my tips to add.
Yeah, great, thank you. Yeah, I think it sounds, it's like you need a lot of passion, but then also being able to distill that. And maybe, as Diane said, you might have a passion for a big program of research, but you don't have to do it all in one grant, which I think sometimes you can feel like is an easier, you have to show how much you can do and how many ideas you have. And
actually 2 months is hard writing, but your planning starts even 6 months before, or even 12. You really, that thinking and is really, really important leading up to the time when you've got pen to paper or computer, whatever.
Yeah. Now I just want to check in, Vicky, yes, do we have any questions in the chat that people have asked we might want to make sure we get to, because I'm just aware of our time.
Yep. Thanks, Kaylee. So Simon has asked that somebody working across mental health practice and research, what type of grants work for an ECR who is a mental health practitioner and a researcher and interested in working across both in translational research into practice? So I guess it's, any hints on the types of grants that would work for those practitioner wanting to move things into actual practice, implement and translate research.
I can have a go if you like. I would say that largely the same grants are available to as are available to people who are spending their total time on research, but you may well have an edge because there's a lot of there are a lot of schemes over time. So I've noticed over my career that there's much greater emphasis now on implementation science and translation and real world impact than there's ever been before. So not only will you be in a position to demonstrate that you're asking questions that have, you know, real world importance, but you're also in a position to get those projects off the ground in a way that someone who's working purely in research and doesn't have any connections with a service or whatever it is may not be able to do. So so I would say that there's some really good opportunities, and largely they're the same as for everybody else, but you may well have an edge. There are also every now and then there are schemes for clinician researchers. So the TRIP fellowships, which I don't think exist anymore, but they were designed absolutely for that, to make sure that people who were not devoting their full-time career to research, so there was that relative to opportunity kind of argument that would normally have to be made. They were designed for people in your circumstance. So I think I would be viewing it as a positive. I'm not sure that you're not, but I think that the opportunities are great.
And I'll jump on and say I kind of was one of those myself. And the category 2 funding was great in. That's the comment. And I noticed in the chat, there's another question a little bit further down that says, where do you monitor that category 2 funding? And you can sign up for Grant Connect emails. And they just come, I just sign up for all of them because I don't want to restrict myself to, but I get all sorts of stuff on farming and things that I'm not interested in. But I just scan them real quick, see if there's something there. And that's where the Commonwealth Department of Health, for example, and other government funding will come out through that. And as a practitioner, I think you stand a little bit of a better chance, especially if you're working in that space and you've got access to partnerships and, you know, lived experience groups and co-design opportunities with the on the ground, from ground up kind of philosophy. That's where you'll really shine, is in those tenders.
And there was, one other question there about mentors and finding a mentor. For some of the large grants, people need to have a mentor, but if there's not someone in your current sort of research centre or someone you know, how do you go about finding that and how do you navigate that dynamic?
Michelle's putting some good, actually, sorry, Michelle, I thought that was a response to the mentor question. I was going to say the university research officers often are quite good at linking people up, but there are a lot of mentoring schemes around. So, for example, we've got some funding that was through a tender for a program that we've called Lifeways, which is about strengthening and providing leadership in suicide prevention research and research translation in suicide prevention across Australia. So we've set up a mentoring program as part of that, and we've matched mentors to mentees. There are lots of schemes like that, but there's also, I would say the mental health research community is pretty generous spirited. So I reckon you could approach almost anyone within that of you know, people who are more advanced in their careers, and ask them if they'd be happy to mentor you. They might well say, well, I've got limited time, we can only meet once every 6 weeks or whatever, but and you know, you might end up approaching a few people or whatever, but I think people are pretty keen to make sure that the next generation is brought along. You know, we're not going to be around forever, so we want to leave mental health research in safe hands.
Yeah, I agree with that, Jane. I think that, you know, I mean, I still get a surprise and a cheap thrill when somebody actually says, hey, can you come and be listed on this or be my mentor? I'm like, really? Oh, okay. So, you know, I mean, but I remember as an early career researcher going, oh my God, I can't talk to that person. They're a professor. That's really scary. We are people. And we do still get, you know, enjoyment out of actually, you know, sharing what we've learned and that kind of thing. And I think specifically Julia asked the question there about listing a mentor in an investigator grant. And I do think it is really important for those kind of things to demonstrate that you've got mentoring in what it is that you're doing in that grant, because I think what they're looking for is actually evidence that you've got somebody who can support you either in the methods, the topic, or both, that is going to help you to achieve what you've put in that investigator grant. Particularly, you know, Diane was talking about, you know, trying to take on the world, and unfortunately the investigator grant format tends to be a temptation to do that. That demonstrating that you've got a capable mentor who's been there before and can help you through that, I think, is an important thing. And if there's somebody that you go, oh gee, it would be great if such and such would help me with them, ask them. We don't bite, usually.
No, thank you, that's great.
And if you do happen to find one that does bite, they're not the person you want as a mentor anyway. But just ask someone else. There are plenty of non-biters around.
That's a good tip. Don't get a mentor who bites.
Yeah, don't get a mentor who bites.
So I know we're reaching towards the end, but we're wondering if we could sneak in one final question for it to go. And it's one we got through the crowdsourcing platform. But I think it's one of those things, you know, when you're an ECR and you're told, you know, you have to have publications and have led projects to get grants. But then sometimes to actually get those opportunities to publish and lead projects, you need a grant to fund you to do it, which also touches on this idea of, you know, a lot of us don't have continuing contracts, very fixed term, and sometimes they're short, which can be really difficult. And I guess the question is, you know, do you have any advice for how you deal with this kind of landscape? And it's kind of, you know, sort of like, how do you get your first job when you're supposed to have experience doing a job already, but, you know, no one will give you that first job?
I think it is about some of that positioning yourself and collaborating with people. So it's you know, you're not going to get the first massive grant you apply for by yourself, so I think it's maybe joining forces with other people. Even if you're CIZ on something, that means that you've got your foot in the door. Thinking about little grants is good too. So it's just gradually building up that track record. That's exactly what I did. I had multiple little grants. They weren't category 1 grants. They were lots of little tiny tenders, and it just sort of one thing led to another. And people start to recognise you. It's, you know, just as I said, the mental health research community is fairly friendly. It's also relatively small, so it's not all that difficult to get known in the area. And I'm not sure if part of the question was also about finding time to do things when you're scurrying around on individual projects and working from one project to the next. But I think you just have to recognise that that is part of the deal, and make time to write that paper from that project, even if you have moved on to the next project. You know, that for me, that was always quite easy, because my favourite thing about my job was writing. So I really found that last bit where I wasn't dependent on anyone else, I could just write the thing, really satisfying. And I didn't mind if I did that as a weekend job or whatever. I kind of liked that thing of, I'm a bit of a completionist, so it felt like completing the project.
Yeah, and if I can just add to that as well, you know, Jane had a thing in her presentation about being strategic and building on things, and always think, when you see an opportunity come up, is it the best opportunity for you to pursue, and how much time are you going to put into writing it, versus what else could you be doing in that time that might give you something else? And I've even just recently made that decision for myself, where initially I was thinking that the end of this year I would go for a future fellowship and an investigator grant. From what I've heard about the latest round of investigator grants, I've gone, that's now off the table. It's a waste of my time. And then I thought, but with the future fellowships, you only have 3 attempts over 15 years in order to be able to go for them. I've already used up 2 of those attempts, but I've still got 3 years of eligibility left. So I've gone, you know what, this year is not the year for me to actually go for a future fellowship, because in that extra 12 months, I can get more papers, more leadership, more of the things, because I'm now competing against full professors when I'm still an associate professor. And so do make sure that every decision you make is actually strategic around building your career, and don't go for something just because it's open if it's going to take you 6 weeks of solid work to actually write that. And at the end of it, you're going to go, oh God, this is another one with a 4% success rate, which some of the philanthropic schemes actually have.
Can I add to find the team where you add value? For example, the fact that Jane just said that, I'm like, Jane, you and I should work together, because I hate wrapping up things and writing the input, but boy, I love the new idea and I love writing grants. So I honestly should just have a career writing grants. And then if I have a, you can't do it all on your own.
Yeah, that's right.
To have a team.
I actually should say I really like writing the grants as well. It's just the middle bit that I'm not so fond of.
You just like all of it. You will find that you have a niche, and you will find a team that's lacking that niche. And that's where the energy starts jiving. That's where again, it's not me. I don't stand alone. It's a significant group of people that surround me, and everyone kind of has their little niche. And we love it when that comes together. And we've got, someone who's really great on ideas, and someone who's really great on publishing the outputs, somebody who's really great on data analysis, and somebody who's really great on, they actually just love, cleaning the data and entering the data, like there's different people who really just jive with different things. And these are people across every stage of their career. Don't make any judgment about who likes what based on their stage of career. In fact, it can be very diverse. And I think the best teams really thrive when you can kind of put all those pieces of the pie into a whole, and then the whole team is successful. And then that's even more rewarding than you personally being successful. So that's, find a niche and show it off to whomever's leading that grant. Make sure you let them know that that's your niche and you're good at that and you're happy to do that. And then and I'm not saying you should work weekends. I'm not saying that, but then your weekend work becomes less like work and more like fun.
Great. Well, thank you. I mean, I'm sure we could probably keep you here for another few hours, but I'm aware that we've kind of reached time now, so I might hand back to Terry.
Great. Thanks so much, Kaylee. So I'm sure everyone in the room would have found that a really interesting and very stimulating discussion about research funding, and also learnt heaps about grants and funding and the landscape and universe. I'm aware of the time, so I won't spend too long with the wrap up, except a big thank you to the stars who have joined our panel, as well as the Alive team who have put this all together for us. I took out some points that I'll remember as well, about passion, about used car sales, about collaboration, global linkages, and also about finding people that don't bite, and the importance of teams. So wonderful messages for me to take forward in my own use, and I'm sure everybody has found messages for their own growth as researchers as well. So I'll close today's session, but I've had a request from the Alive team that for those who are happy to be in a group photo for this event, if you're happy to stay online, and I think Dana's going to organise a screenshot, which is our group photo. So if you have time and are interested, please do that. But otherwise, thank you so much for coming along, and a big thank you to stars on the panel.
Thank you.